All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our Parsha of the Week class, our Pardes class, in which we examine a section of the Torah portion from the various angles of Torah study, Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod, and come to appreciate the colorful beauty of Torah. So, today, I'd like to focus on a section of this week's Parsha, which is the Parsha called Chaya, Sara, the life of Sara. In this week's Parsha, we come across the passing of both Sara and Abraham and Sarah both pass away in this Parsha. The Torah portion begins with the story of the passing of Sara and her burial. The first time we have, really the only time where we have the topic of burial described at length in the Torah. And immediately after that section of the Torah, in the Torah reading for Monday, Sheni, we begin chapter 24, which is where the Torah kind of takes over after the passing of Sara and how Avraham's life continued in the aftermath of his wife's passing. So here we are, chapter 24, verse number 1. And let's read the first 5 verses and then revisit them to understand them more in depth. Chapter 24, verse number 1. Avraham Zaken, Abraham was old, Ba Bayamim, advanced in days. The Hashem Beirach es Avraham Bakol, and God blessed Avraham with everything. Verse number 2. Vayomer Avraham el Avdo Zekan Beso. Avraham said to his servant, the elder of his house, Hamoshel Bechol Asher Lo, who ruled over all that was his. Simna Yadcha Tachas Yerechi, place your hand under my thigh. The Eshbiacha Bahashem Elokei Hashamayim, verse number 3. And I will cause you to take an oath in the God of heaven and the God of earth. Asher lo tikach isha libni, you should not take a wife for my son, mi benot haKanani, from the daughters of the Canaanites, asher anochi yoshev b'kirbo, in whose midst I dwell. Verse number 4, rather, ki el artzi ve'el moladeti telech, rather you should go to my land and to my birthplace, and over there, v'lakachta isha libni lib Yitzchak, you should take a wife for my son Yitzchak. Verse number 5, Vayomer elav ha'eved, the servant then said to Abraham, ulai lo tove ha'isha l'leches acharei, what if the woman does not wish to go after me to come to this land where we live, which is Canaan? Should I then maybe come back with your son? You know, there's a much greater likelihood that I could find a wife for your son if I take him along with me. So if I can't find someone to come to trust me and come to see him, could I bring Yitzchak with me to that land? Vayomer elav Avraham, and Avraham said, no, hishamer lecha, beware, lest you return my son back there. He said, please do not, no, you may not bring my son back to outside of Israel. And he goes on to say, because Yitzchak, my son, is not allowed to leave the Holy Land. And in fact, in the 180 years of Yitzchak's life, he never left the land of Israel. Unlike his father, Abraham, who certainly was in and out of Israel, the Torah tells us that, and unlike Yaakov, his son, who also was in and out of Israel, for that matter, his grandsons, the tribes were in and out of Israel. I don't know of anyone else who the Torah tells us in the 5 books of Moses, of anyone else who we are taught spent their entire lifetime in the land of Israel. Anyway, so here you have the first 6 verses of the Torah, and now let's expand, starting with Rashi's commentary. So, first verse, Avraham Zakin ba bayamim, Hashem berach es Avraham bakol. Avraham was old, advanced in days, and God blessed Avraham with everything. Beirach es Avraham bakol. What exactly does that mean? Actually, this whole verse is strange. Avraham was old, advanced in days. Isn't that an obvious redundancy? If you're old, you're advanced in days. And if you're advanced in days, you're old. Hashem Beirach es Avraham bakol. And God blessed Abraham with everything. What does that mean? What exactly is everything? What was he lacking until this point that he had now? So Rashi, let's perhaps for the rest of this study session, let's focus on these words and come across the various commentaries on it. So the first thing is what Rashi tells us, that Va'avra v'Hashem beirach es Avraham bakol ola begematria ben. The word bakol is numerically equal to the word son, that God had blessed him with a son. Now, why is this necessary to tell us now? We know that he has a son. We know that he has a son Yitzchak. We know that last week's Torah portion already. But the reason it says this here is because this allows us to appreciate the next section of Torah. Because he was blessed with everything, and he was blessed with a son, now it was time for him to marry off his son. That was part of his parental obligation, is to marry off his son. What's interesting, though, is as follows. There is a medrash which says that bakol over here is not a son, but rather a daughter. Now, Avraham was blessed with a daughter. And in fact, her name was Bakol. The daughter was named Bakol. So that's how the Medrash tells us. The Rashi says Bakol in this simple pshat means a son. Simple meaning over here means that he had everything, including a son, and therefore he had to marry the son off, which is what the following section tells us. But the Gemara says that Bakol actually means that Bakol was a daughter, and that daughter was named Bakol. So, and now I'll read an interesting Gemara, which initially will come across as offensive to women. But upon further review, you'll realize that it is not intended to be offensive to women. And that is like this. Bakol, says the Gemara, my Bakol. What is the meaning of Bakol? Everything. Reb Meir Omer. Reb Meir says the blessing that the Torah is referring to over here is Shelo Haita Lo Bas, that he did not have a daughter, and that was the blessing. The blessing that the Torah is referring to over here is the fact that he didn't have a daughter. Okay? That's kind of hurtful. What's wrong with daughters? Furthermore, it seems to be inexplicable because halachically, when the Torah tells us that a person is obligated to procreate, the mitzvah of procreation, which was given to Adam and Chava, and given again to Noach and his wife, what is the definition? What is the fulfillment of the mitzvah of procreation? It's a fascinating Talmud. There's all sorts of opinions of what is the fulfillment of the obligation of procreation. And the halachic answer to that is the opinion of Beis Hillel, who says that you fulfill the mitzvah properly by having a son and a daughter. So we know that he had a son. So how could Rameir say that it's a blessing that he didn't have a daughter? We'll get to that in a moment. However, the second opinion in the Gemara is Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, to the contrary. The blessing that's referring to is the fact that he did have a daughter. He had a daughter whose name was Bakol. So that makes sense. Throughout, we see Abraham until this point was given all sorts of blessing. He had longevity. He had a son. The one thing that was lacking was a daughter. And so the Torah tells us that towards the end of his life, he remarried and had a daughter, and she was named Bakol, and that explains the blessing that he had. What is how are we to explain the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that he was blessed by virtue of the fact that he didn't have a daughter? And the commentaries in the Talmud explain as follows, that even though, yes, without a doubt, sons and daughters, and particularly if one who has both sons and daughters, there's a blessing to that. In Avraham's situation, a daughter, in the opinion of Rabbi, would not have been a blessing. And the reason is because a daughter he would have to marry off, and in the ways of the world at the time, the woman would then follow in the path of her husband. And it's very likely that whoever the husband would be would have been a pagan, or would have taken his daughter and drawn her away from the path of Judaism or monotheism, which Abraham believed in. As it is, according to the mayor, he only had a son. That son was Yitzchak. And as the story plays itself out, Rivka is found, and she comes from a corrupt family. She comes from a pagan family, but she is taken from there. The Talmud compares it to a rose that's collected from among the thorns. That's how it describes Rivka. So Rivka was collected from that situation and brought, and then enters Abraham's home, marries Yitzchak, and continues the beliefs and the ideology and the Jewish foundation which Abraham and Sara had established. So that's how Rameir explained that he was blessed by not having a daughter, because there's a strong chance that were he to have a daughter, she would have gone in a path away from Judaism. Interestingly, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, that he did have a daughter, whatever happened to that daughter? We don't know. Whatever happened to Bakol? We don't know. So it could be the Rameir's concerns are warranted. I don't know. Maybe something I have to do more research into, is because we don't hear about Bakol afterwards. So maybe it is, in fact, the case that she was led astray. Who knows? I don't know. But the point is, Bakol certainly doesn't become according to the explanation that Bakol is a daughter, we don't come across any additional, at least not, it's not readily known, additional information about how Bakol continues to play a role in the story of the Jewish people. But let's share a few other answers, a few other explanations that the Talmud says as to what this blessing is. Again, it's a very vague blessing, a blessing of everything. So we explained the answer of Rabbi Meir, the again, unique answer that he was blessed by virtue of not having a daughter. The opinion of Rabbi Yehuda says he was blessed with a daughter. Rabbi Eliezer of Modai says that Abraham was an expert in astrology. And at the time, astrology was extremely popular. And therefore, the kings of the East and the West would all come to the door of Abraham with questions about astrology. And that's what Bakol means. God blessed him with everything. Bakol means every people, that all people, he was blessed by the fact that all people of the world, or all people of his region, came to him for guidance. And obviously, based on what the Medrash tells us, Abraham would not suffice by simply answering their questions about astrology. But Abraham would then influence them about Judaism, about his belief in monotheism. So therefore, Abraham had a blessing that even in his old age, some people would say it's not a blessing. To have people knocking on my door all day long is not really it's not a blessing. But for Abraham, it was a blessing because it was an opportunity to influence all the people who came to his house. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai answers. He gives a more mystical explanation. Rabbi Yochai is the author of the Zohar. And he says that Bakol is a reference to an Even Tova. He had a special stone that he hung on his neck, and it had powers. It had somewhat healing powers. Kol choila haroya oisai, any ill person who saw him would immediately be healed. So according to Shimon Bar Yochai, when the pasuk says Abraham was blessed with everything, similar to the previous opinion of Rabbi Lazar, that he was blessed by virtue of the fact that everyone came to see him. But he says for a different reason. Rabbi Lazar says people came to see Abraham because he was a master of astrology. He says no, he had a special stone which had healing powers, and everyone came to Abraham to bless him, to receive his blessing. And again, as soon as someone came to Abraham, we know that Abraham then continued that work by teaching them about Torah and Judaism. So that was the ultimate blessing, the fact that people came to visit Abraham. And finally, one last opinion of what this Bakol is, Abraham, that Hashem, that he blessed Abraham Bakol, is the Gemara says Davar Acher, that he was blessed with everything in the sense that during his lifetime, his descendants were all righteous. And the reason that's significant, because that's unlike his son, Yitzchak, who sadly lived to see the evil ways of Esau. Avraham, in his lifetime, all of his descendants were righteous. How so? So even though Yishmael had turned his back on his father's faith, but the Talmud tells us that towards the end of his life, Yishmael did tshuva. Yishmael was a Baal tshuva. And says we know that from the fact that at the funeral of Abraham, later described in this week's parsha, it says that Yishmael allowed Yitzchak to walk ahead of him, which was an act of humility and becomes an indication of Yishmael doing tshuva, which, by the way, answers a question, and that is that we come across later in the Talmud, we come across someone named Rabbi Yishmael. In fact, the Rabbi Yishmael was a Kohen Gadol. He was one of the high priests, which raises the obvious question: why would we have a high priest named after Yishmael, who really does not come across as righteous in the Torah? So there's various answers given. But one of the answers is because Yishmael did tshuva. The fact that Yishmael did tshuva, he finished his life as a tzaddik or as a Baal tshuva. So therefore, we have that name becomes an appropriate name to give later, even though today it's not a very common name among Jews, but at least it was at one point. Anyways, Yishmael does tshuva before Abraham dies, and Abraham does not live to see his grandson Esav becoming a Rasha, because Abraham dies right at the time of Esav's and Yaakov's bar mitzvah. So therefore, by the time Abraham passes away, they are not yet culpable for their actions. And so therefore, that becomes the final explanation of what it means that Abraham was blessed with everything. In other words, that he saw, and perhaps the greatest gift is someone who's able to look at his children and descendants and see them all following in the path of Judaism or of Torah, of monotheism, as Abraham taught. So those are, I think we gave 5 explanations for Bakol. We have a few moments. I want to share one more idea about this verse. An idea from the Rabbi, in which he says, "Avraham zaken ba bayamim." Avraham was zaken, was older, ba bayamim, and advanced in days. So there's a medrash on this, which states as follows: there are some, says the medrash, Avraham zaken ba bayamim, says the medrash, some people are blessed with zikna, with zaken, but not baba yamim. And some people are blessed with yamim, but not zikna. Some people are blessed with elderliness, but not days. Some are blessed with days, but not elderliness. Whatever that means. So the medrash is kind of strange. We don't typically separate between being old or being advanced in days. It seems to be the same exact thing. So what is the difference between them? So the Rabbi gives the following explanation. And that is that Zaken and Baba Yamim is a reference to the two. It so happens that this past, I see at least on the screen, at least the name of Doreen Weisberg. I don't know if that's Doreen or Steve joining us, but either way, this past Friday I got to go visit Doreen's mother with my children, who was a woman who just celebrated her 101st birthday. And it's one thing to go to see someone who's 101 years old. That in itself is unique. But to go visit someone who's 101 years old, who is fully coherent, is able to follow and have conversation and dialogue and hold the baby and communicate with your children and smile and engage and understand, I mean, that's quite a blessing. So it really comes to mind. You think about Zakin, Baba, Yamim, not just old, but old with blessing, with their faculties intact. Is a very remarkable blessing. But the Rebbe then spells out that actually Zakin and Baba Yamim, old and entered into their days, has a very spiritual double blessing over here. So Zakin, which is that word, Zakin, elsewhere in the Torah, in the Talmud explains that Zakin is a acronym for Zeh Shekana Chachma, 3 letters, Zayin, Kuf, Nun, Zeh Shekana Chachma, someone who has acquired wisdom. Zeh Kana Chachma. It even says so with regards to honoring. The Torah says, V'hadarta pnei zakin. Elsewhere in the Torah, we are a Torah obligation to honor someone who is older, So there's actually two obligations. One is to honor someone who is elderly, but there's a separate obligation for someone who has acquired wisdom. So zakin represents wisdom. Ba bayamim that is a reference to Torah study. Ba bayamim, entering their days, says the Rabbi, is a reference to mitzvah observance. The idea of ba bayamim is literally entering every day, represents the opportunities that every day presents. When it comes to Torah study, you wouldn't necessarily associate that with the opportunity of every day. Torah study is an intellectual pursuit. So you pursue, but every day, what the difference between one day and the other really has to do with one's mitzvahs. Every day presents a new opportunity. There are new mitzvah obligations every day. In fact, many of our mitzvah obligations are a daily obligation. We make the morning blessings. We do it once a day. There's an obligation to recite the Shema twice a day. And there's obligation for prayer every day. So the distinction between days is more so emphasized with mitzvah observance. And then there's certain days which have unique mitzvah obligations. Obviously, Shabbos brings in its own obligation of mitzvahs, and as do the holidays. So zaken is a reference to Torah study, intellectually perfecting oneself, and ba bayamim is a reference to the mitzvah opportunities that every day provides. And the Torah is telling us that we have to value every single day. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with someone who asked me, he said that within the last few years, he's had several near-death experiences. And he says specifically one in particular is where he went scuba diving he's about 70 years old. He went scuba diving in Mexico, I guess, and he got pulled in by a riptide and he lost consciousness. He was underwater for 4 minutes. And he says, he says he knows that I could be dead right now. He tells me. So, and he was asking, he says, what is the message that I'm supposed to walk away from this? What is God telling me? And look, I said I'm not a prophet, but my thoughts about that is that God gave you a new gift of life, and therefore the response to that is you got to prove to God that God made the right choice, and you do so by bringing meaning and value to every single day. By recognizing that every day you didn't have to be, and very, very possibly could not have been. And really that's true for all of us, but for someone who sees that more clearly firsthand, it's true for all of us. And the greatest response to that is by saying, okay, I'm going to take, God, you gave me this gift of life. I'm going to prove to you that it was the right choice. And I will enter every single day. And the entry into every single day is by performing mitzvahs every single day. So Torah study is not necessarily as specifically connected to a daily, even though one should study Torah every day, but it doesn't necessarily have the same connotation as mitzvahs. Mitzvahs, really, there is that unique separation one day to the next. Each day brings in a new obligation of mitzvahs. And that's what the Rabbi says over here, is that when it says Abraham was zakin and ba bayamim, it means that Abraham took advantage of both. He took advantage of the intellectual pursuit of Torah, understanding God, and also ba bayamim, which are the mitzvahs. And the Rabbi separates, he says, it's not just two different pursuits, they're two inherently different pursuits. Torah study is more so about perfecting oneself. When I study, and when I engage in understanding of God's ways, I am perfecting myself. I am elevating myself. I'm elevating my intellect. And proper study is not just an intellectual pursuit, but it's an intellectual pursuit which leads to a change in my behavior. But it's Torah study makes me a better person. Mitzvah observance is more so about making the world around me better. And often in life, you have people who choose one or the other. Both are holy, both are virtuous, both are righteous. But one may say, especially later in life, at this point, I will study, I will engage in the pursuit of understanding and perfecting, making sure that I'm a holy person. And I do so by meditating on what God means to me, on God's Torah, and the understanding of the Torah. And some people feel like, I'm not concerned about myself. I'm concerned about making the world better. And therefore I'll give charity and I'll volunteer and I'll help out and I'll do mitzvahs. But the truth is that shleimus, which means the bakol, as the end of everything, means if a person engages in both, and both with intensity. That I say I have to challenge myself through study and through meditation to become the very best person I can be, elevate all of my soul, which has Kabbalah points out, there's all sorts of elements in my soul: Chachma, Bina, Da'as, the 3 intellectual spheres, the 7 emotional spheres. I got to work on that to become the very best I can be. But then, in addition to that, I also have to think about my obligation to the world around me, and that's primarily accomplished through mitzvah observance. And therefore, when a person has that balance in which they work on themselves, which is zaking, and they work on the world around them, which is babayamim, then if a person really does so, then a person can say that I truly have bakol. I have accomplished everything when it comes to the blessing of Hashem. And that's how the Rebbe explains this verse and the unique nature of Avraham, that Avraham was perfect in both areas of Torah and mitzvahs, of self-perfection as well as commitment to make the world around them better. All right, we'll stop here. Thank you all for joining. And God willing, we'll continue next Wednesday with the Torah portion of Toldos. We'll study about Yitzchak and Rivka. All right, pause the recording.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.